There's a lot of negative headwinds in chemicals globally, and I'm going to read some of them here. First of all, overcapacity in China, a lot of that including in surfactants. Overcapacity in the Middle East as part of their diversification efforts into chemical production. A lot of tariff uncertainty, of course, depressed profits at chemical companies overall, a lot of negative earnings revisions for the first quarter of 2025, a terrible economic situation in Europe, particularly in chemicals, continuing supply chain uncertainty, some of that's linked to tariffs, of course, and a depressed chemical merger and acquisition picture for the last 3 years, steadily fewer and fewer deals in that sector. So despite all that, however, there are some glimmers of positivity, particularly in the US, and we'll hear about that in a bit. But first, in Europe, there is demand destruction in chemicals on a pretty large scale. And here's some evidence of that. ICIS has the European chemical capacity utilization at 61%. That's pretty bad. In the UK, chemical demand is 64% of what it was 5 years ago. In Germany today, chemical production is 26% below what it was in May of 2021. In contrast to that, in the US, it's 7% above the May 21 level, and in China, it's 19% above. Lyondell, Dow, BASF, many others are making pretty significant cuts in Europe. The Dow to cracker is shut down indefinitely, for example, and Dow's European polyurethane business is, quote, up for review, which means they're readying it for sale. Natural gas today is 3 times more expensive in Europe than it is in the US. And as we know, Germany abandoned nuclear power just before the start of the recent phase of the Ukraine war. And so what the overall consensus is right now with respect to this demand, depressed demand in Europe, it's not coming back anytime soon. A lot of this is permanent, and that's a pretty dire assessment of the chemical situation in Europe today. Sustainability ambitions remain, but consumers are becoming a little more realistic and a little more reluctant to pay for it. As a result of that, we're seeing companies, including, for example, Unilever and Nestle, either shelving sustainability goals, modifying them, or stretching out the timeline. In addition to that, petrochemicals is seen as a major driver of chemicals growth. In particular, for example, Aramco is planning to convert 80%, ultimately to convert 80% of the oil barrel into chemicals rather than fuel. And that's driving a huge growth globally in petrochemicals. So what about the bright spots? I mentioned there's a few. There's actually more than a few. So the US is a major chemical exporter with around a $30 billion trade surplus in chemicals. Even with the 2018 tariff wars with China, the US exports of ethylene and derivatives to China are up 5 times versus 2017. The US Purchasing Manager Index, the PMI, right, which everybody looks at, finally moved into positive territory after more than 2 years in negative territory. So that's a pretty positive data point. There's continued US business optimism around tax cuts, around deregulation, and reshoring in particular. The China response, it's early days, but the China response to tariffs has been limited so far. Even over in Europe, the upcoming German election offers a chance for a reset, particularly in the area of energy. Consensus of the panel, today, the best place to invest regionally in chemical production is the United States. One driver for that is that US crackers today ethylene crackers are the most cost competitive in the world. So despite the dire statistics, there are a number of reasons for optimism. Finally, I asked the panelists if they had a big chunk of money, let's say $10 billion, that they had to invest in the chemical sector, where would they invest it? I got some interesting answers. One, an electronics chemicals facility in Arizona, very specific. Number two, a very large integrated ethylene cracker. No surprise there. Number three, biomass conversion into a range of specialty chemicals. And number four, chemicals, broadly defined chemicals for wire and cable to support data centers. So again, couple that with optimism around the US chemical industry, and I think the picture is not as bad as perhaps first thought. Thanks as usual again for listening. I hope you found this useful. Please do let me know what you'd like to talk about in future editions. Thanks again.